Bonjour à tous, welcome Iedereen. Bienvenue donc dans notre cycle de conférences du Conseil central de l'économie. Nous avons aujourd'hui évidemment le grand plaisir d'accueillir André Sapir. D'abord pour moi c'est un plaisir d'accueillir un de mes professeurs. Évidemment ça fait toujours plaisir d'accueillir un professeur qui a marqué mon cycle universitaire. Mais c'est aussi évidemment quelqu'un qui a un parcours académique remarquable et qui exerce toujours aujourd'hui des responsabilités par rapport aux enjeux qui nous intéressent, non seulement dans le cadre de cette conférence, mais aussi évidemment dans les travaux du Conseil central de l'économie. Donc, M. Sapir est aujourd'hui évidemment toujours président de l'Institut d'études européennes de l'ULB, membre de son conseil stratégique. Il est Senior Fellow Researcher à Bruegel, ainsi qu'au Fellow, alors je n'ai pas de dire des bêtises, au Center for Economic Policy Research à Londres. Il est membre de l'Académie royale des sciences et des arts de Belgique. Et au niveau évidemment des travaux qui nous intéressent, évidemment il a marqué les travaux de la Commission européenne, puisqu'il y a un rapport quand même assez connu sur l'Europe et la croissance porte son nom, hein, le rapport Sapir, et il a été évidemment conseiller d'un nombre important de commissaires européens, y compris du président de la Commission, et aujourd'hui il travaille évidemment intensément avec le commissaire européen, alors j'ai peur de mal le prononcer en italien, Gentiloni, on dit comment
Gentiloni.
Gentiloni, voilà, sur les enjeux évidemment de l'économie européenne suite à la crise Covid et suite aux enjeux environnementaux. Donc c'est dans ce cadre que nous sommes évidemment ravis de l'accueillir. Donc la conférence sera en anglais. Mais comme d'habitude, vous pouvez évidemment poser vos questions en français et en néerlandais dans le chat. Het is mogelijk uw vragen te stellen in de chat. En met Chris, we proberen alle vragen te stellen aan meneer Sapir. Professeur, je vous laisse la parole.
Merci beaucoup Benoît pour ces extrêmement gentils mots d'introduction. Let me now switch to English and say how much I'm happy to be participating in this series of seminars. Very impressive, and already congratulations to you for this series of seminars. I think indeed on a very important, very important topic, and I hope to bring my own vision on some of those issues. And I'm looking forward to the discussion, to a very active discussion. So I've been asked to speak for roughly 45 minutes to give enough time for the question and answer. And I hope now I've started to share my presentation. I hope it's visible to everyone. The title I've chosen is the macroeconomic management of the COVID-19 crisis by the Euro area / European Union in historical perspective. Now, why I added the element of historical perspective? Because it's not typical to speak about macroeconomic management. Macroeconomic management is something a little peculiar in the Euro area, European Union, because of the way the Treaty of Maastricht designed economic and monetary union. And so I want to start my historical perspective from Maastricht in the early 90s. And what does the treaty, what is the framework that is provided by the treaty, and then move on. And we will see that that framework has a number of weaknesses, and those weaknesses they were shown bare at the time of the financial crisis, of the great financial crisis, of the sovereign debt crisis. And then it's from there that I want to move on to discuss the management of the COVID-19 crisis in the light of the framework provided by the treaty and of the experience and sometimes painful experience that we had about 10, 15 years ago during the financial crisis. And then I will examine, what has been the way Europe and the euro area have tackled and are still dealing with the issues. And I will finish with a number of sort of open questions that are in front of policymakers. And we shall see what is the answer. That will depend on many, many factors, including obviously political factors. And that will also refer to the German election of this Sunday. That certainly will play a very important role. So this is sort of more or less the outline of my presentation. So let me start with the Maastricht architecture for EMU, for economic and monetary union. Now, when one talks of macroeconomic policy, one talks about monetary policy on the one hand and fiscal policy. Now, what is peculiar in a sense to economic and monetary union as defined by the Maastricht Treaty and still obviously valid today, is that monetary policy is centralized. There's no more national monetary policy. Yes, we have the National Central Bank in Belgium. We have the National Central Bank in each of the 19 euro area countries. But the central bank, the European Central Bank, is the one that sets the monetary policy. So we have a euro area-wide monetary policy exclusively, no more national monetary policies. But for fiscal policy, it's the opposite. There is no centralized capacity. There is no Minister of Finance of the euro area. There is no budget of the euro area. There is no fiscal policy stance of the euro area. There are only national fiscal policies. So each of the member states of the euro area, each of the 19 countries, Belgium and the other 18 countries, they each conduct their own fiscal policy. Now, is there some degree of coordination? Well, coordination of fiscal policy has always been a very, very difficult question that is not really well answered by the treaty. All that the treaty really says is that fiscal policy is subject to, by the member state, is subject to certain rules. And the rules as defined by the treaty, by the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty use the term reference values. Reference values with respect to the deficit and with respect to the debt. And the treaty, the body of the treaty actually never uses the values, the reference values of 3% and 60%. Those are specified in a protocol attached to the treaty, which is called the EDP protocol, the Excessive Deficit Procedure Protocol. And that protocol there says the reference values that the Commission and the Council should use when they evaluate national fiscal policies and the national budget. Those reference values are 3% for the deficit, and they are 60% for the debt level. But the term reference values is the one that is used in the treaty and is used on several occasions. Now, one had to wait. So the treaty, if you remember, the Maastricht Treaty is 1992. So monetary union was supposed to be launched in 1999. And then when it became clear that indeed monetary union would go ahead on time as agreed upon by the countries in Maastricht. Then in 1997, essentially Germany wanted to have something stronger, a stronger legislation about the deficits, not so much about the debt level, but about the deficit, about the 3%. And that's when the Stability and Growth Pact was written and was agreed upon. So the Stability and Growth Pact is not in the Maastricht Treaty, but it's legislation based on the Maastricht Treaty. And what essentially the Stability and Growth Pact says is that, look, 3% is not simply a reference value. 3% is a hard ceiling, not just something that the Commission should use in its evaluation of the member state and see, well, you know, we are approaching 3% or we are beyond 3% and there is some kind of a yellow light that is lightning there, and, you know, one should tell countries, you know, be careful. No, the Stability and Growth Pact says countries should maintain during normal times a budgetary balance which is close to balance, close to zero, or in surplus. In other words, countries should always allow room for maneuver so that they will not go over the 3%. Now, I'm saying this because even today, I was listening yesterday on television to a minister not in Belgium, but in another country, that was, you know, saying, you know, how should we treat the Stability and Growth Pact? And everybody interprets the Stability and Growth Pact as saying, you know, we should not have a deficit in any year above 3%. That is not at all what the Stability and Growth Pact says. You know, people have simply not read, and still so many years later have not really understood what the Stability and Growth Pact says, is that 3% is a hard ceiling. You should never be above 3%. And in order not to be above 3% in a bad year, in normal year, you should keep sufficient room for maneuver to allow the automatic stabilizers to operate when there is a downturn. And that means that in a normal year, you should have the deficit close to balance, or even have a small surplus. So the Stability and Growth Pact was really, in a sense, an important addition, and it's clear why it was there. It was added in 1997 because Germany feared that countries like Italy, and Italy in particular, that had already, like Belgium, a very high debt level, would continue to have high deficits. Now, we move forward. Now, what happens when there is a downturn? You know, what does the treaty says about macroeconomic stabilization? As I said before, the treaty does not provide at all for coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And that is understandable in a sense, not from an economic perspective. From an economic perspective, it's hard to understand, but from a political or from a legal perspective, it's easy to understand because of what I indicated before. There is a centralized monetary policy, so there is the ECB in charge of monetary policy, but then you have 19 countries in charge of fiscal policy. So there is not a centralized fiscal policy, so it's hard to coordinate between a centralized monetary policy and decentralized fiscal policy. So what is the spirit of the treaty? The spirit is that in case of a symmetric shock, a shock that affects all the euro area, the response should be via the common monetary policy. So if it's a shock that is affecting all member states, then it's all member states that need to respond with the instrument that they have in common, the monetary policy. On the other hand, if the shock is an asymmetric shock, a shock that affects one member state or maybe 2 or 3 member states, then it's up to the national fiscal policy to respond, mainly via the automatic stabilizers. And the automatic stabilizers, I repeat, that according to the Stability and Growth Pact added in 1997, should always provide for sufficient room for maneuver of fiscal policy for not hitting or for not going over the 3% ceiling. Obviously, if the recession is very, very strong, then the Stability Pact already provided the clause that would allow countries in exceptional circumstances to go over 3%. That is, to go beyond the use of the automatic stabilizers. Now, you can already see that by this absence of explicit coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policies for the reason I indicated, there is really no notion in the treaty of a euro area-wide policy mix. There's no guarantee that what monetary policy, which is geared towards the euro area situation, on the one hand, and the national fiscal policies on the other hand, if you add up the national fiscal policies of the 19 countries, there is no guarantee that the fiscal stance, which is sort of an artificial fiscal stance, simply coming from the addition of the fiscal stance of each single member states, that the policy mix between the common monetary policy and the addition of all those fiscal policies would provide for the right policy mix to deal with the economic situation. Something that Lamfalussy had already pointed out in the law report in preparation for the of the launch of the monetary union by the treaty. And in addition, something that will be very important when we discuss the COVID crisis, there is no provision at all in the treaty for what economists discussed as the zero law bond. That is the situation when monetary policy is hitting the fact that interest rates, as is the case today and already for several years, is at zero. Monetary policy is then really limited. It can still act, and we know that central banks, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, that have, at least the advanced countries that are facing this kind of difficulty, where nominal interest rates are at zero, and therefore the interest rate instrument for monetary policy cannot be used. We know that central banks still, can use their balance sheet. Nonetheless, it's clear that monetary policy is very much constrained by the situation we are in today and have been for several years, that we are at the zero lower bound, that is interest rate at zero. So you can't go beyond that, and that is limiting monetary policy. No, the treaty doesn't talk about that at all. What to do when monetary policy is not potent and you have a difficulty when you need to use monetary policy. So I'll come back to that. So that's the framework, and that framework, the weaknesses in the framework really created problems for the first time during the financial crisis. At the start of monetary union, for the first 10 years of monetary union, it didn't seem that there was a problem. But what I think there is general consensus now and already for about 10 years, that the architecture, the Maastricht architecture, failed to do two things. First, it failed to prevent the buildup of huge imbalances in the monetary union during the first 10 years, between 1999 and 2008. When it seemed that the system was working, in fact, there were those imbalances. Things appear to be quiet, but under the surface, there was a huge buildup of imbalances that then created the difficulties with the financial crisis and sovereign debt crisis that followed the, let's say, Lehman Brothers. So when the crisis hit us, again, the architecture, the Maastricht architecture, was not up to a swift resolution of the crisis. And that's why the crisis, in a sense, we had a double dip recession, not only in 2009, again in 2012, and obviously we had repeat crisis with Greece and with other countries that really was a threat, not only to the monetary union itself, but to the economic and social situation in many of our countries. Now, there are however different readings of those failures. So everybody agrees, whether you're talking to people in Southern Europe, people in Northern Europe, people who have, whatever their views on the monetary union, I think everybody agrees that the architecture failed, but there are different readings of where the failure were. Where the failure mainly on the part of countries that did not follow the Stability and Growth Pact, that did not provide sufficient room for maneuver in good times, was the failure on the part of the European institution that did not prevent the buildup of the imbalances, or were the failure really of a structural nature, that the system itself was lacking a number of instruments to deal with the issue. That consensus never really existed, and I think that was always and still is to some extent a problem today. So there are different readings of the financial and mostly the sovereign debt crisis, even though everyone agrees that there were failures of the system, but different views about where exactly the failure lies. Now, we all know that the turnaround in the financial crisis, in the sovereign debt crisis, came in 2012. So it took, several years of painful mishandling of the crisis. And I think the important events of 2012 were first the Van Rompuy report towards a genuine EMU. And the word genuine is very, very important. I mean, there is a recognition that Maastricht EMU is not genuine. So we need to build a genuine EMU. And the report is very clear about the famous 4 pillars that need to be improved or built. There was also in 2012 the creation of the European Stability Mechanism, that mechanism which is based in Luxembourg and which is outside of the EU treaty. There was in June 2012 when Herman Van Rompuy presented his report, there was the important decision to create the banking union. And as we know, the banking union was created, but still today in 2021 still incomplete. And then comes in July 2012 the famous declaration of Mario Draghi, the president of the European ECB, saying that the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the integrity of the euro. And that was all of those decisions together, political statement by Mario Draghi, obviously backed by, in implicit manner at least, by the political declarations in the European Council. All of those did provide a turnaround and slowly the end of the crisis. Now, sadly, however, many of the ideas of the Van Rompuy report, and then what came to be known as the 4-president report, later there was another report called the 5-president report. All of those reports, although decided upon by the presidents of the various European institutions, both at the fiscal level, with the Eurogroup president, at the monetary side, the ECB, the president of the European Council, the president of the European Commission, even the 5-president report, the president of the European Parliament. Those ideas have yet to be implemented. So when the COVID crisis hit us in the spring of 2020, it was by no means obvious how the euro area, given the incompleteness still, the fact that we are still not a genuine monetary union in the sense of Van Rompuy, given this incompleteness of the architecture, it was not quite clear how the EU and the euro area were going to respond. Were we going to face another type of crisis of the sort that we had seen back during the sovereign debt crisis? Was there going to be again a Greece someplace? What about Italy? There were all the political uncertainties still in Italy, and everybody was a bit wondering what was going to happen. And you remember that there were these initial declarations by the president of the ECB that created a little bit of uncertainty or jittering in markets, even as to what was the ECB ready to do. It was clear that the crisis, the COVID crisis, was a symmetric shock. It was a symmetric shock because it's an exogenous shock. It was not shock made by policies of countries. You could say at the time of the sovereign debt crisis that it was not a symmetric shock, that it was an endogenous shock linked to the handling of fiscal policy, of budgetary policy by certain countries, by Greece and by other southern countries. And one could have that reading. I don't know that I completely agree with that, but that reading is certainly possible and was very, very prevalent. You could not have that reading, obviously, with the COVID crisis. Nobody felt that the COVID crisis was due to bad handling of policies by countries. It was exogenous, and therefore, being exogenous and symmetric, hitting all the euro area countries, it's clear that the primary instrument had to be, in normal times, would have been monetary policy, except that there was little room for conventional monetary policies because we were at the zero lower bound with interest rates at zero or close to zero. So it gave little space for conventional monetary policy. Now, luckily, I think the monetary authorities and the political authorities in the EU and the euro area reacted rather swiftly in the spring of 2020, and giving essentially to member states what I call a license to borrow and to spend whatever it takes. What the monetary authorities, what the ECB did, is to provide the room for member states to have very expansionary budgetary policy. And how did they do that? Well, on the political side, there was a decision to suspend the fiscal rules, the Growth and Stability Pact, the Stability and Growth Pact, and the other fiscal rules. So, in a sense, the 3% ceiling was clearly suspended. So countries were told, you can spend whatever it takes in order to keep the citizens, the company, firms, citizens, workers, and citizens in general afloat. So you should not be bound at all by the 3% limit. And for its part, the ECB launched its PEP program, essentially a program buying assets. The purchase of assets, mainly government bonds, initially up to 750 billion euros, but expanded in 2 tranches by the end of 2020 to 1 trillion, nearly 2 trillion euros. So big guns on the part of the ECB, a license to borrow and to spend, and made possible indeed by the backing of the ECB and the authorization, if you want, of the Council with the suspension of the fiscal rules. In addition, and this is really what has been new in the COVID crisis, there's been direct support at the EU level with 2 instruments: the SURE window to help countries finance schemes for firms to keep workers employed by companies on reduced time, and the NGEU, the famous 750 billion new generation EU program that includes the 672.5 billion recovery and resilience facility that I will discuss now. A facility that, as you all very well know, includes both loans made by this facility to the member states for up to 360 billion euro, and then grants to countries up to 312.5 billion. Now, let me just spend a little time on the NGEU RRF facility. Again, in historical terms, I think it was and it still is a very, very important change compared to what there is in the treaty or the way we handled the financial crisis, because it's the first time in history since the creation of the EU, not just the creation of monetary union, but the creation of EU. And here we should talk about EU, since those are EU instruments, not euro area instruments. It's the first time that the European Commission is allowed to borrow, to make grants to member states. The EU budget makes grants all the time, obviously, to member states, but this is based on the money that member states provide into the budget, and as you well know probably, the treaty does not allow the budget to run into deficit. That possibility does not exist. So the books have to be balanced every year. And so that's why when the EU makes grants, and every year out of this multi-annual budget of 7 years, the money has been provided for at the start of the 7-year cycle. What are going to be the receipts to the EU budget and what are going to be the expenditures? And every year the budget is to be in equilibrium. So the EU and the Commission does not have the possibility normally to borrow money to make additional grants. Here, there was a solution to this, given the possibility for the European Commission to borrow in order to make grants, something that had never happened before, not even for three pennies. The Commission was also allowed in JU to borrow, to make loans to member states. And that is a possibility that existed already before. The Commission could borrow with the backing of the member states to make certain loans, but they were rather small loans. Typically loans in case of a difficulty of balance of payments outside of the euro area, not in the euro area, or also in case of, let's say, natural disasters. But they were very small magnitude, not at all the kind of figures that I put forward. So this is really a novelty. And although the idea had been discussed by Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, who had been one of the founding fathers of monetary union, was later a board member of the European Central Bank, also then finance minister in Italy during the financial crisis, at the start of the financial crisis and the euro area crisis in 2010, he proposed exactly, in a sense, the kind of program that was done now, that the EU, the European Commission, would borrow money and then lend to the member states or make grants to the member states. That idea at that time, so only 10 years ago, essentially, 10 years before 2020, that idea was completely rejected by everyone. That idea could not even be heard at the level of finance ministers and leave alone of heads of the state. It was completely outside of the sort of the Maastricht vision. And I think that's really important to see that, how things have changed in 10 years, and I will try to explain why what was impossible in 2010 was possible in the spring, summer of 2020. Now, let me go into this. Why this time was different? Why could could the EU do in 2020 what had not been feasible before, and what didn't look feasible according to the Maastricht Treaty? I think the first element is the magnitude of the crisis, of the downturn in 2020, and I'm showing here GDP growth for the EU for the period from the start of the EU. This is 1961. Okay, we know that the EU starts in 1958, but this is, let's say, the entire period since the start of the European Union, of the EEC in the early 1960s, late 50s, up to 2020, and you see that the downturn in 2020 here is by far the most severe, even more severe than what we had seen during the financial crisis in 2009, 2010. So I think that is the first reason, is the magnitude of the crisis. The second reason that I already indicated is that it was a totally exogenous crisis. It was not a crisis that was policy made. It was not a crisis that could be attributed to mismanagement of the economic situation, of the budgetary situation, by individual member states or by a group of countries, as was the case during the sovereign debt crisis, where the core euro area countries felt that the peripheral countries of the south had mishandled their budget, or sometimes also issues with their housing sector. There certainly we had an exogenous crisis and a symmetric crisis. Now, it's true, however, that not all countries were affected by the downturn. The GDP shock in 2020 was different across countries, and I show here, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's important to keep in mind that although all countries were affected, and every country had a negative shock in 2020, the magnitude of that negative shock was not the same. And one can discuss why that is the reason. Is it simply bad luck that some countries had more COVID than others? Was it also the handling of the COVID crisis? My view is that it's a bit of both. But nonetheless, it's clear that all countries were on the same boat, although some were in a boat where there was more water than others. Third factor that played a role was the memory of the handling of the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, the austerity measures, the mistakes that I described before, due partly to the Maastricht framework, or at least the use of the Maastricht framework, this sort of north-south divide that we had seen during the financial crisis. There was also now a risk, again, that the southern EU countries were being affected very strongly by the crisis. There was also fear of political uncertainty, populism, the situation in Italy, the situation in some other countries, the situation in Greece, and then also some difficulties in Eastern Europe that initially was not that affected by the COVID crisis, but then turned out to be rather weak in some of its institutions, and also was quite a bit affected. So let me skip this slide. The last factor I think that played a huge role was the geopolitical situation. We were in 2020. There was still we were still in a sense the Trump era, the remnants of the Trump era, the difficulty at our borders in Turkey, in the relationship between Europe and Turkey, relationship with Russia, the conflict between the United States and China. So a very complicated geopolitical situation. And I think a number of countries, in particular Germany, did realize that given the fragile geopolitical situation, Europe could not afford to enter into the kind of crisis that we had during the financial crisis, that we had to show unity in Europe in the handling of the crisis. And I think that played a very, very important factor. So it's all of those factors, I think, that made the agreement in July 2020 to create the new generation EU and the recovery and resilience facility possible, and made that a reality. Now, I'm showing here, and I think it's very important to look at the spreads between sort of the weaker southern countries, and Greece is being left out here because it would be completely outside of this graph that shows on the left hand side here. If you look at the axis, one is looking at in percentage point the spreads between the 10-year bond yields in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, 3 southern countries, compare to the bond yields for Germany, the Bunds. And if you look at the period at the beginning of the euro area here, this period here, it was very, very quiet. And then comes the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis with the peak here in 2012. When you look at 2020 here, you see that there is a little peak, and that's at the start of the COVID crisis, when there was the hesitancy on the part of the ECB, whether the ECB was ready to do whatever it takes on its part, that is essentially putting in place the PEP program. Once the ECB decided to do that and the fiscal rules were suspended, then you see that the spreads fell, and we did not have at all the kind of crisis that we saw in 2012. So in the sense, the framework that was put into place in the spring or summer of 2020 was very, very successful in averting any sovereign debt crisis. This has not been the name of the game at all since the beginning of the COVID crisis. So the COVID crisis was well handled. There's not been a EU or Euro area-wide crisis making headlines in the global financial press, the FT and others, as long as this. Now, I'm not going to, I think probably there's not enough time now to discuss in detail how the RRF money is being allocated between the member states. What are the criterion for the grants? What are the criteria for the loans? But I think what I want to indicate is that the NGU, the new generation EU, and in particular the RRF, has a strong redistributive component, both in the grants and in the loans. So if you look together what the grants and the loans, to which countries they go, and I divided countries into 3 groups: the southern countries, the eastern countries, and the northwestern countries, the core of the EU Euro area, the richer countries, the Benelux countries, Germany, and the Nordic countries, together with Austria. You see that most of the money is actually going to the southern countries. 61% of the grants and the loans that were possible were going to the southern countries. 26% goes to the eastern countries, which is a big share, much bigger than the GDP share. And the countries of the north and the west, including Belgium, they only take in 13%. So in a sense, if you wanted to use that analogy, although it's not quite correct, they are net contributors to it. It's not quite correct to talk about net contributors because the money that goes into the RRF doesn't come from the national budgets. And this is one of the issues. Where will the money come from to reimburse the borrowing, those bonds that the Commission is issuing to finance the program? They will have to be reimbursed at some stage. There is the guarantee of the member states, but the idea is to reimburse them via some EU-wide financial contribution, not financial contribution coming from the member states. And this is the discussion still related to digital taxes, to taxes on climate, sort of EU-wide taxes that would finance, and which has not been politically decided yet. So that's why it's not correct to use the term net beneficiary, net contributors. But there is a notion certainly that the southern countries and the eastern countries, they are the ones who are getting, and rightly so, because they were the weaker countries. They are the ones that are receiving most of the grants and access to the loan facility, while the countries of the north and the west are relatively small recipients. Now, if you look, and this is what is, what was at least possible, if you look at the grants and loan allocation according to the decision of July 2020, you see that in absolute terms, the main beneficiary would be Italy, followed by Spain. This is in absolute amount, by Poland, by France here, Greece, Romania, etc., and with Belgium receiving a rather small amount also. We are, as we know, a rather small economy, and we are not borrowing. Belgium is not borrowing out of the facility. It's only using the grant facility of roughly 5-6 billion euro. Now, we know that countries, in order to get access to the RRF money, they have to prepare national plans. Let me not get into this, but let me just show here something that I think is important. You know, the actual submission that country made, requesting money from the program. And there, Italy is really, one can see that Italy is really very, very big. I'm showing here only Italy, France, Germany, and Spain, the 4 large countries. The different colors are indicating how countries were intending to spend the money on different parts. On green, it's in green here, on digital in blue, and on other programs in orange. And you see that different countries have made different choices, even though there's an obligation to spend certain amounts, at least on green, and certain amounts on digital, but then there was certain room for maneuver of countries. I think the more important numbers here are the absolute amounts. You see that Italy made requests both for grants and for loans, totaling roughly 200 billion euros. If you look at the request of France, Germany, and Spain, those are requests only for grants, not for loans. Even Spain, that was in principle eligible for loans, did not so far request loans, so only made requests for grants. And you see that France made request of roughly 40 billion euros, Germany roughly 30, and Spain roughly 60. So Italy, on its own, as a program of both grants and loans that is bigger in size than France, Germany, and Spain together. So Italy is really a huge program. And I will want to say something about this. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether the decision that were made last year with this exceptional creation of this facility and allowing the European Commission to borrow for grants, something that it never been able to do in the past, and also to borrow for loans at a much bigger extent that it had done in the past, whether this amounted to what people have referred to a Hamiltonian moment, obviously referring to what had happened 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago in the United States, when the federal government assumed the debt after the war with England, or during the war with England, where the federal government issued for the first time U.S. bonds and taking over the debt of some of the U.S. states. Now, is NGEU, is the recovery and the resilience facility, is it a Hamiltonian moment? I think there is broad agreement that it is a very, very important political step, but it's not quite a Hamiltonian moment. And one of the reasons why it's not an Hamiltonian moment is because the regulation says very clearly that this is an exceptional measure. This is not a recurring facility that has been created. So one has not created at least the political decision has not been taken so far that what was done in the spring or summer of 2020 would be available for future crises. This is not a euro area or EU-wide facility in case of, further crisis of a similar nature. No, the regulation says that this is exceptional. But what is exceptional today could obviously, if the money is well used, And if there is another crisis, obviously memory will be there. And so it is not impossible that although the agreement so far is that it should not be recurrent, doesn't mean that it cannot happen again. And I think that's when I think there are lots of questions open out of the COVID crisis. And let me put forward some of those questions and then come to a close. The first question, I think, major question is how to ensure the success of the recovery plan. And in particular on the part of Italy. Italy is such a big component of the recovery and resilience facility that the success or failure in the years ahead of this exceptional program will rest very much on the success or failure of the use of the money by the Italian government. Now, in work that I have done, I have shown that, you know, the different performance of countries in 2020 was not just bad luck, was not just entirely exogenous. There were also some endogenous factors. And one factor that did play a role in the heterogeneity of situations of countries in terms of GDP shock in 2020 was linked to the quality of national governance. Countries that had better national governance, even with the same exogenous shock, they did better than those that have poor national governance. And it's true that a country like Italy, and I think well recognized by Mario Draghi in his program, Italy suffers from a number of governance issues. So the money, and that's why I think it's important that the program is not called just the recovery program, it's called recovery and resilience. And resilience means that indeed, in some instances, including countries like Italy, there needs to be major reform to improve national governance, or sometimes regional or local governance. So, so it's a big challenge. I mean, those are long-standing problems, and it is not only in Italy. Those problems exist in a number of other countries. But I mean, this is really a major issue about the heterogeneity of the euro area. There are structural problems, including of governance, that need to be resolved, that need to be improved. So, I think success of the recovery plan very much related to quality of governance, and Italy, because of the size of the program, the huge size of the program, Italy is really key. There are still pending issues about how to finance the reimbursement of the EC bonds. Again, this issue of a digital tax, of a climate tax, those are politically extremely touchy issues. And you know, whether the EU will be able to make agreements on that or not is something that is still to be decided. And then the point that I raised before: will the new facility become permanent and constitute, despite the agreement that it is temporary, but will it actually politically, will there be at some point an agreement that it should become permanent, and will it constitute the beginning of this centralized capacity, this fiscal capacity that was missing in Maastricht? There's also a question about whether the RRF plan is sufficient. You know, I just want to show you some data here, which I think one needs to keep in mind. Those are the latest figures from the IMF. This is the July 2021 update about the figures for 2020, 21, and 22. And I just want to emphasize only those figures that are here in my red frame. If you look at the projections for 2021 in the 4 largest euro area countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, you know, growth is, you know, compared to what we know, you know, growth to be in a normal year, growth is very fast. Yes, growth is expected to be 5.8% in 2021 in France, 3.6% in Germany, 4.9% in Italy, 6.2% in Spain. But look at what was the downturn in 2020, minus 8% in France, minus 4.8% in Germany, minus 8.9% in Italy, and minus 10.8% in Spain. In other words, the growth in 2021, although very strong, is less than the degrowth, than the decline in 2020. That's the situation in the euro area. So before we congratulate ourselves about the fast growth in 2021, we need to compare this with, the shock that we had in 2020. Compare this to the US. In the US, growth in 2021 is expected by the IMF to be at 7%. Faster even than in any of those large euro area countries. But look at the shock in 2020, it was minus 3.5%. So the recovery in 2021 is faster than the shock, is bigger than the shock that we had, completely different than the situation in the euro. So keep that in mind. So the recovery is strong, but the downturn in 2020 was very, very big, and you need to put that in perspective. So, big recovery and big programs, and I think Europe and the euro area is doing well, but we still could do better. And then the final question is about the fiscal rules. It's clear that already prior, and that's my last slide, already prior the COVID crisis, the fiscal environment had changed a lot compared to Maastricht. We have much higher public debts and much lower interest rates than we had at the time of Maastricht. I borrowed this from a paper by Marco Butti and Victor Gaspar that show it's on average for the euro area, where we were at Maastricht. At Maastricht, on average, member states had roughly 60% debt at the time of Maastricht. That's why the figure of 60% was adopted in the Maastricht Treaty, in the protocol. 60% was not such an invention. It was simply the average debt of the countries that were members of the EU at the time. Okay. Now, if you look at the same countries today, we are roughly at 100%. So you see here there was a little decline. Then there is the financial crisis here. Then again a little decline, and then back to the COVID, the increase in the debt. So the dark blue here refers to the right-hand side axis, and this is 60% around the time of Maastricht. Then if you look at the left-hand axis, this is about the interest rate. This is the light dark line here. This is bond yields, average bond yields for the countries of the EU at the time of Maastricht. We were at the time of Maastricht, about 10% even higher, average bond yields. Now we are roughly at zero. So the environment today is completely different from the environment of Maastricht. Higher debt, but much lower interest rates and much lower bond yield. Now, what does that mean in terms of sustainability of public debts? Well, you can look at this in two manners, right? You can say, well, should be very worried because debt levels have become much, much higher than they were at the time of Maastricht. We are much higher than 60% on average. That's the worrisome part. The more optimistic side is interest rates, and interest rate payments out of the debt are very, very, very low. And that is the debate that we are having at the moment among economists, among policy makers, how to read the issue of sustainability. You want to put the emphasis on the level of the debt or the emphasis on the level of interest rate and the payment, the interest payment that are a very, very important factor. So it's clear that the COVID crisis has increased the debt levels, and it also increased difference across euro area countries. I'm showing here the debt level, the debt to GDP level ratios for the period from 1991, so from Maastricht roughly, to 2026. Those are the projections of the IMF. And I show this for the four large countries, for Italy in green, for France in yellow, for Germany here in magenta, for Spain in blue, and I added Belgium, which is in the red. And I'm also making the comparison between 2007, just before the financial crisis, and 2026. You see huge increases in the debt level, and also big differences across countries, right? Italy, very, very high debt. Then you have a group of countries here, Belgium, Spain, and France, roughly 120% debt to GDP ratio, and Germany, which will have in 26 a debt to GDP ratio even lower than it was in 2007, just on the eve of the financial crisis. So divergence, and in particular, I think politically very important divergences between France and Germany. Now, nobody is clearly arguing today in favor of austerity. That would be completely crazy. And one does not hear, you don't hear, even from the most austere people, in the sense you don't hear a call for austerity today. The Stability and Growth Pact rules are still suspended until the end of next year, but it's clear that something will have to change in the coming years. Whether it will be the fiscal rules that will be changed, and you will have a seminar with my Bruegel colleague Joel Davas, who will talk to you about the golden rule and a potential green golden rule, how to handle the expenditures linked to climate. Will there be a need for cutting public expenditures in some areas in order to be able to increase them in others? Again, the issue of aging of population and climate change. Or will there be a shift of some expenditure to the EU level, sort of this with EU facility? That discussion, that political discussion is yet to be had. It's clearly starting. We see that already on the margins of the ECOFIN, on the Eurogroup. There are discussion of this. And I finish by showing that this discussion is going to be difficult, and this discussion is going to be difficult because once again we see huge heterogeneity across countries, and certainly as far as the debt to GDP ratios. I'm looking at the numbers for 2021. In fact, the median, if you look at the 19 countries in the euro area, the median level of the debt is 70%. So it's not so high. That's the median. The average is much higher. And which country is exactly at the median level is Germany. Germany, as this year, Germany and Finland, they have a debt to GDP ratio of 70%. You have some countries that have much lower levels. Some of the Eastern countries, Luxembourg, also Netherlands, also Ireland, they are at or below 60%, or certainly below the median. But then, okay, let's leave alone Greece, which is here the outlier. But among the other countries, as we already saw, you have Italy, you have Portugal, you have Spain, you have Belgium, you have France. France now is belonging to the same group of countries, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. And so there is this heterogeneity, and that heterogeneity is clearly also reflected in the political discussion. So lots of discussions to be had in the coming months about what to do. What are the lessons from the COVID crisis? What are the lessons for the architecture of the monetary union? I leave it there and stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, André, for this presentation. Very interesting presentation. I have a lot of questions for you. Do you think that it's possible to adapt European fiscal rule? For example, it's possible to replace the rule of 60% for debt by sustainability of the debt. And thus it's not the same for each country. It's not a unique criterium, but more adaptive. I don't know if it's correct, but adaptive criterium for each country, taking into account the context of the country and the interest rate. What do you think about that?
So I would say, I give a double answer. I think that from an economic perspective, this is extremely sensible. So, if you were asking a group of economists to design the rules, And it's clear that sustainability would be center. One would start from there. How to evaluate sustainability? No, sustainability is not an exact science. Sustainability analysis is done, as we know, by the IMF. The ESM is doing sustainability analysis. The Commission is doing sustainability analysis. And sustainability analysis is partly based on what you observe today, but also your expectation about the future. What kind of growth you are going to have in the future, right? Your debt is more sustainable, even if you have very high debt level, if the growth rate in the future is going to be high. Now, you don't know what is going to be the growth rate, and I don't know what is going to be the growth rate in 10 years. So we have to make assumptions. And that's why it's not an exact science. We may make different assumptions about the situation. We may make also different assumptions about political crisis in countries. Because what matters is not just the growth rate, is also the capacity of countries at some stage to tax its own citizens, right? In order to be able to face some fiscal difficulties. So it's both the growth and the fiscal ability of countries to say, you know, there is money out there, and I'm taking money from some citizens in order to face a crisis. Are you able to do it? Are you not able to do it? Nobody knows. So I think the notion of sustainability is very, very important. I would like sustainability indeed to play a much bigger role. The question is the implementation of that. And that's why people discuss, you know, committees, you know, would do that. Do you want to leave that to politicians? Do you want to leave that to experts? What kind of experts? I mean, all of those kind of. Could you go to something like the ECB? Is it thinkable that there would be some kind of a fiscal board? And there is already a European fiscal board like the board of the ECB. That is independent of the political world, appointed by the political world, that would make that judgment. And that it would not just be an opinion given to the member states that then would negotiate with one another. Okay, as has been the case typically so far with the fiscal rules, right? The fiscal rules, the Commission makes an assessment, the Commission makes a proposal, but ultimately it is the Council, it is the ECOFIN Council that makes a decision whether or not there is an excessive deficit and there should be some measures taken. And we know, you know, once it goes to the Council, well, it's by nature, it's a political discussion. So should it remain a political discussion about sustainability ultimately, or should it be taken out, out of the hands of politicians, out of the hands of Parliament, right? It's ultimately Parliament that decides on budget. So this is by no means an easy question. So it sounds very appealing to say, you know, we will have a bureaucratic, technocratic, economic discussion about solvability, sustainability, but the implementation in a political world and in a world where, again, we have 19 member states, it's by no means easy. The treaty, in a sense, would allow it. Remember what I said at the beginning. 60% is only written in the protocol. The main text of the treaty always uses the term reference value. 60% is a reference value. 3% is a reference value, then hardened by all kinds of supplementary measures, including the Stability and Growth Pact. But so once you talk about a reference value, certainly sustainability, well, it could be used that you keep 60% in the treaty, you don't change the protocol, the EDP protocol, the 60%, but it's a reference value. And it's a reference value that should be used in the sustainability analysis. Why not? So the treaty would allow it. Economic sense would allow it. The real question is politics. How do you implement this? And I think this is a very, very serious problem, of which, frankly, I do not have the answer. Everybody's trying to grapple with that kind of question. I know that Olivier Blanchard will talk to you. He has made a proposal that is also involving ultimately the Court of Justice. It's the Court of Justice that ultimately will decide something. Now, okay, you see, it's a very odd system, and everybody's trying to find a way to, you know, to have a bit less politics into this, but politics still remain. Is that through the Court of Justice? Is that the way to deal with it? I don't know. But it makes ultimate sense to me that indeed there are different situations in different countries, even 60% in one country. And, you know, if you have two countries that have the same level of debt, it doesn't mean that you have the same level of sustainability. It's obvious. So you can't sort of just do, you know, look at numbers. Where am I? I have 120% debt level. It means I'm more or less sustainable than another country that has 60%. We saw what happened with Ireland and Spain during the financial crisis. They had very low debt levels. They were well below 60%. But they had both countries, so they had managed their fiscal affairs very prudently. They were very sustainable. What was not sustainable was private debts. Private debts, the housing crisis, the housing bubble in Spain and in Ireland, and suddenly the private debt became public debts. So, you know, you have to be careful. How do you examine this? You have to make a very, very careful analysis. And among economists, there would be disagreement, and I think among politicians, there would be even more disagreement. So I think that's the reality. So good idea, difficult to implement. And so I think, I'm not saying this to reject the idea, I'm saying this, I think we can make progress on this. But we are not going to replace the current system by simply saying this magic word, sustainability and sustainability analysis. No, this will not be enough.
Thank you very much. Another question that maybe is the same answer for you, but is it possible to distinguish COVID debt of green debt, or debt with to invest in transition and so on? Is it possible in the European fiscal rule to distinguish the COVID debt, the green debt, with the normal debt, the debt of the country before the COVID crisis? It's a good idea or it's not a good idea?
So I would say the COVID debt is not a good idea. A debt is a debt. A euro is a euro. And, you know, as we always say, and we used to say when I was working in the commission, money is fungible, right? You can call, you know, whatever you want. It's money in the end, right? And it's public money. Now, I would say green, I think one can have a discussion. Now, why I'm opening at least the possibility of a discussion for green, because here I think the word that I would use is not so much green, is investment. It's not green, it's green investment. So if you add the word, so COVID, as typically most of the expenditure associated to COVID has not been investment, has been about income maintenance. Okay, so no, let's forget about that. Now, should we make a difference about investment and public investment, including green public investment for climate? That has been a long-standing issue in the since Maastricht. You know, should there be a golden rule? A golden rule that is a different treatment in the fiscal rules for expenditure that is linked to investment. So from the start, that discussion has been there, and already in the Stability and Growth Pact, when the 3% figure was put forward as sort of a hard ceiling, and the notion that in normal times countries should be close to balance, should have their budget, their public budget close to balance or in surplus, came the issue, hey, wait a second, you know, does that leave room for public investment? Are you wanting countries, you know, if you have on average over the cycle, if you have zero deficit, how do you finance investment? And I think that is a very, very important question. So again, economically, people have recognized that there is a problem with the rules that may not leave sufficient room for public investment. And we saw that indeed during the financial crisis, when austerity measures were adopted, the austerity measures, not only they led to a double dip recession, but they led mostly to a cut in public investment. So when governments, a number of governments had to cut public expenditure in order to satisfy the fiscal rules, in order to do austerity, the austerity was geared to what was politically more easy, not social transfers, but public investment, and therefore jeopardizing future growth prospect. And that was indeed very, very silly. So, you know, you have austerity and you're taking measures to decrease your public expenditure, but at the same time, you're affecting the denominator, which is your GDP and your GDP growth. So it was a not winning battle, right? You were taking measures on the numerator, on the fiscal side, but killing the growth on the denominator, and therefore not helping your debt to GDP ratio. So the notion that one should treat differently investment from other public expenditure, I think, is well recognized. And if you look at the current rules, even on the Stability and Growth Pact, they have made some possibility for that. So government, when they put forward the budget, they can argue that some of the expenditures are expenditure geared towards increasing growth. That can be done, can be a reform of structural nature. There can be all kinds of measures that would increase growth. Investment is one of them, but there are other measures. You know, I spoke about governance that can also help, obviously, growth prospect. So I think that notion is there. You will hear from, again, from my Bruegel colleague, you will hear this notion of green golden rule. So what they are proposing is not golden rule that includes all investment, all public investment. And the reason is that the discussion on public investment and the discussion on golden rule has always been hampered about a discussion what is public investment. And the typical example that is given in that discussion to show the fuzziness of, you know, what is public investment or not is education expenditure. Buildings are considered as public investment. Money spent on teachers is not considered as investment. Does that make sense? Are teachers less important than buildings as far as the future growth prospect of a country? The answer is definitely no. So where do you draw the line? What is an investment? What should be considered an investment or not is a difficult question that countries are not agreeing upon. And so to make fiscal rules when countries don't agree on something is very, very complicated. So there is a sense that perhaps countries can agree on certain green expenditures, public investment for climate, and that they can be a decision at the European level, monitored, as it is the case with the RRF, right? There is the monitoring by the European Commission and ultimately by the European Council, that they could be a decision that, let's say, for the next 5 years, countries can and should do public expenditure, green public expenditure of a certain type, and that this will not be counted towards their deficit. So in a sense, a centralized decision of what counts as public investment, rather than haggling bilateral discussion between a member state and countries about what is and what is not constitute green investment. So first establish at the European level a list of expenditure that could be agreed upon for the next 5-10 years as green investment. And those indeed could potentially be taken out of the deficit calculation. So in that sense, a green golden rule, but limited to green investment and to investment that are well targeted with monitoring by the Commission for each expenditure. So you would want to do an expenditure, public expenditure, you know, a few billion spent on certain things. It would need to receive the prior agreement of the Commission that, yes, indeed, this is a green investment that falls in the box that we have agreed upon, in very much the same the same approach as what we have for the recovery and resilience facility, where there is the monitoring by the Commission. So that could be, in a sense, that could be a legacy of the RRF, this green golden rule. I think that discussion seems to me is feasible.
Thank you very much. Keith, do you have any other question?
Yes, there are some questions about what we just talked about. It's difficult to define public investment, but Renat Hansens from ACV, he said, aren't the rules of the ESR very clear on what is an investment in a public asset and what is a current expense? So isn't it a false argument to block a general golden rule?
So again, I mean, I repeat, I mean, the person is right in one sense, but one is dealing here with 19 countries, and where we know that creativity in budget is important. So one should not minimize this. So conceptually, I think there's no disagreement. There's no disagreement also that the rules are pretty clear, but when it comes to the implementation of the rules in the European framework and the European framework that I described before, I think this is where the difficulty is. The difficulty to have 19 governments that are entering into political discussions, what ultimately is political decision. The Eurostat has to make a judgment, but ultimately it's the ECOFIN Council that decides. And I think this is where the difficulty is. So I think it would be much better to go for something targeted, like the green investment, with a very, very clear list of what constitutes or what does not constitute a green investment, rather than simply talk about public investment. Because and we have seen, I mean, and Belgium has been one country that has disputed for a long time the interpretation of the rules by Eurostat, that they felt that they've been too strict. And I think that discussion is an important discussion. I'm not saying that Belgium is making a mistake to bring that discussion, but it has been a very frustrating discussion because there's no political agreement. So I'm trying to find a solution to the fact that the politics, it's hard to remove from this discussion. So how do we, how do countries accept to bring about ex ante, not ex post, not do an expenditure and then go to the discussion, yes, that falls, yes or no. I think it would be much better to have an ex ante agreement and targeted to certain expenditure with strong monitoring by the Commission. And we have to be realistic. What can be done. I think it's probably of a limited nature. And again, money is fungible. Even though they are investment, and even though one is claiming that those are investments that have fantastic returns, we shall see what returns they have. So public expenditure is public expenditure. It has to be counted at some stage towards the debt. It will increase the debt. And if the money is not well spent, then it will increase the debt, even if you put it out of the deficit. So I think one should remain careful, especially when we have at this stage very, very high debt level in some countries. So I would be careful, but I would not close the door at all to that distinction.
Yeah. Also, Edward Roosens asked, it would be interesting to have an idea what is understood under the green golden rule. So I think we will discuss some more about that, and also with your colleague. And then he says, he hopes that the green investments would be more easy to define and to delimit. You think it will be more easy to have good definition on the green investments and that there will be an agreement on that more easily?
So I think, yes, I think, you know, we have, there's been this discussion already for well over a year by the Commission with the member states and also with financial markets about the nomenclature about green, what constitutes green investment. And that's more related to sort of financial products. You know, what can you call a green bond when governments or private companies are issuing financial products that they call green. So, you know, that work has been there. I think that work will also help define from a budgetary viewpoint what constitutes green investment. So all this work, I think has been very useful for the financial side, but I think would prove also very useful from the budgetary side. So we can use that. Now, whether that will translate into a political agreement, that is a different matter. So I think technically one can do the job, but the question will always remain, I think, twofold. One is the worry that some will have that debt levels are already high, and that this is simply sweeping under the carpet expenditures that are adding up to the debt, and that we are simply putting aside, but they will need to come in the numbers of the debt. They will not be in the deficit, right? They will not be counted against the 3%, if you wish, but they need to be added in the debt levels. And means for the debt sustainability analysis, it needs to be included, right? We are not going to exclude some numbers. You need to have the full picture when you make the debt sustainability analysis. Nobody's proposing that the golden rule means, you know, those debts, they are being sent on Mars. The debt will be on the books of countries. So it's simply that it would not be counted in the deficit, in the excessive deficit procedure. So I think the discussion will be there with the figures that I showed before, that debt levels are very high. So this is what some countries are going to put forward. Others are going to say, but look, interest rate is very low, and you know, countries can borrow for free. Okay, this is something that you hear all the time. You know, why should we worry about that when countries can borrow for free? They should borrow as much as they can, since they can borrow for free. Yes, it's great to borrow for free if you make good use of the money. You still have to reimburse what you've borrowed for free, what you call borrowing for free. Borrowing for free doesn't mean that you don't need to reimburse. Means that obviously if the rate of return is higher than the interest on which you pay, then indeed it's fantastic. But who can guarantee that public investment will have the rate of return that you hope for? Nobody can guarantee that. So therefore you need to be careful, and all the more so if you already have a high debt level. And so that discussion will be there. There are high debt levels. The others will say there are very low interest rates. Sustainability is not really an issue. So they will have to find an equilibrium. And my sense is that, yes, the climate issue is being viewed by all member states as very, very important. There needs to be huge investment for climate, not just, by the way, for investment. There will be also social expenditure linked to, we already see the situation in some countries with the increase in energy prices. So there will be huge increased expenditure, some of them investment, some of them social expenditure linked to climate. I think every country understands that. So, you know, we have aging, but we have climate. And so we need to deal with that. So I think countries all understand that investment for climate is important. So my sense is that they could agree on some small set aside for green golden rule. Not 3%, not even probably 1%, but maybe 0.5%. I think this is the kind of numbers. If I had to imagine a compromise, that would be, it seems to me, the maximum feasible politically. 0.5% every year of green, golden rule, golden investment.
Okay,
0.5%
thank you.
of GDP.
If I can continue with a question on that subject, also Renat Hansen said that financing needs for the green and climate transition will be very huge. What are the risks of financing these needs partially through money creation by the ECB via purchase of EIB loans, etc.? What are the risks of financing this through money creation?
So, okay, that's a good question, and I think it's a question that brings me to a subject I've not discussed so far. Is the prospect, the whole discussion that started in the United States, but has now crossed the Atlantic and reached the shores of Europe about the risks of stagflation. So we see that inflation and inflation expectation is rising. To some extent, it's good news in Europe, where the ECB has not been able to meet its target of close to but below 2% inflation over the medium term. And the recent review of monetary policy by the ECB, changed a bit somewhat this target and sort of brought more symmetry in the 2% target. But it's clear that the ECB has been at pains for a number of years to deliver inflation, which is its primary objective, to deliver on its primary objective of inflation, medium-term inflation of 2%. So rise of inflation is partly a good news. If we believe that it's better to have 2% inflation than 1% or even close to 0%, and risk of deflation is always there. At the same time, what nobody wants is to have inflation that starts galloping, that the central banks are losing control over inflation, and that at the same time that inflation rises, there would be a recession. So that's the stagflation, right? Stagnation and high inflation. This is what we had in the 1970s, and that led to very, very painful policies, and painful also debt problems, with much lower starting point than we have at the moment. At the moment, we have very high debt level already in some countries, and Belgium is one of those countries. So if we were to enter into a period of stagflation, not just a bit of gentle inflation that would a bit erode the debt, that would be great. But if we start to have not just inflation and inflation that starts galloping, and associated with that, we have a growth problem, sort of the stagflation, which means that eventually the central bank has to take very tough measures on monetary policy, while at the same time the central bank, knowing that doing that would really create financial problems, or at least problems for the governments, because there is so much debt out there, that would bring to huge dilemmas, policy dilemmas for the central bank. And that would mean basically that the central bank would lose its independence. I mean, it would have to monetize essentially the debt. I mean, some have said that the central bank has already been doing that, and I would not go that far at all, that the policy during COVID has been debt monetization. I think it has been the right policy, providing the space, given that we were at the zero or lower bond, providing the space for government to do whatever it takes. But it's the governments that have taken that responsibility. But if we were to enter into a difficult period of stagflation, then I think there would be also difficulty for for the fundamentals of the euro area, which is the independence of the central bank. And then we would be really in a situation of fiscal dominance, where the central bank is doing what the fiscal authorities are telling it to do. And I think that would pose a problem because, again, as you have seen, the debt situation of different countries is different. There would be the southern countries, including Belgium and France, the countries that have high debt level that would push the central bank in this direction. And then you would have countries like Germany, Netherlands, and others that have lower debt level, that are not facing potentially a debt crisis that would push in the opposite direction. And that would be a major political crisis. And the ECB would be in the middle of that crisis. Last year, when the ECB did the PEP program, there was agreement among the member states to do that because of the COVID situation and because the COVID situation was symmetric. In the future, we could have an asymmetric situation once again, and therefore bringing back the political problems that we had during the financial crisis when countries did not agree. It's not that we could not have handled the crisis sooner than 2012, it's that countries had the different reading of the cause of the crisis and the handling of the crisis. That it was a political crisis. It was not an economic crisis. It was an economic crisis, a financial crisis due to political disagreement up to the summer of 2012. So if we re-enter into this kind of situation because of stagflation, I think that would be quite dangerous. So you know, we have to be definitely very, very careful, and that's why I'm not one would propose that we don't care anymore about fiscal rules. We just talk about sustainability and everything is rosy and forget about debt levels. Just think of the low interest rates and this will remain forever. And, you know, spend as much as you want because money is free. I think this is a risky proposition. This is a risky proposition. But if we can target expenditure at growth-promoting measures, including on green, this is great. But let's monitor that very strictly, and let's also remember that, as I said, there are huge differences in that level. And when there will be a turnaround for the worse, we already know which countries will be hit. I remember being at the ECB. It was in October or in November 2009, at the very, very start of the financial crisis, Lehman Brothers. And I showed a chart there that indicated that spreads were increasing in some countries. You know, spreads that had been very, very low, difference of yields between the German Bund and the yields in other countries had been, as I showed in my chart, had been very, very low during the calm period from 1999 to from the start of the euro until 2008. Very, very calm. And then when the financial crisis started, markets suddenly started to make a distinction between countries. While during the calm period, they were not making any distinction. You know, you could have very high debt level, you could do all kinds of crazy things, as happened in Greece, for instance. With the Olympic Games, you could do all kinds of accounting tricks. Nothing happened, right? Nothing happened. And then when the crisis started, markets started to panic. They started to make really differences. And you saw that already in 2009. They started to be differences. In 2008, there started to be differences between countries right after Lehman Brothers. No, and the weak countries, obviously, that were in the eye of the storm. And then soon there was Greece, and soon there was Portugal, and soon there were other countries. And Belgium, you remember, was a bit in a difficult situation itself. So, and it's that problem that is really, I think, the most complicated problem for the euro area. Not to be all on the same boat. To say, there are some countries that have not been careful before, and they have the crisis now of their own making. That day we will again be in the situation as we were before. We will not be in the COVID mode. The COVID mode is we all suffered, and this was exogenous. It's not anybody's fault. But when countries will have done bad investment, and those bad investments will have added to the debt, and countries would be differentiated by markets, this is when the political difficulty will reappear.
Mm-hmm.
Last one, Chris. You have a last one question? No?
Peut-être encore une petite en français là. Peut-on considérer qu'il y a dette dès qu'il y a investissement? That's perhaps a simple one. Can we say that there is a debt as soon as we have an investment?
So yes, if you borrow, mm-hmm. if you borrow for that, not if you make it out of current revenue, right? But nobody would propose in their right mind of an economist that you finance investment out of only current revenue, and that has been one of the discussions with Eurostat. So it makes sense to borrow to finance investment that will take several years and that will yield revenue also over a stream of revenue over the future. So it makes perfect sense. Yes, so it adds to the debt. It adds to the numerator, to the debt to GDP ratio. No, hopefully it adds also to the denominator, right? To the GDP, to your capacity of producing and to reimburse the debt. So, yes, it increases the debt, but does not necessarily need to increase problem of sustainability. It may be good for sustainability. So it may be a good debt, absolutely. So debt, there are different debts. But whether it will turn out to be a good debt or not, only the future will tell us. And I'm back to my remark that sustainability is not an exact science. And what turns out to be sustainable or not, only the future will tell us.
Yeah. And there was also a question of Luc Norga who asks what are the effects of the monetary policy on the real economy. We have the policy of quantitative easing and the facility. But what are the effects on the real economy? Is there really its profits on the real economy? What is your opinion about that?
Yeah. So I want to talk about the real economy and I want to talk about the financial side. So I think that yes, the quantitative easing has been useful, but depends when you do it. So if you want to refer to the PEP program, the program put in place by the central bank to purchase assets, mainly government bonds, during the COVID crisis, I think that has been extremely positive for the real economy, because after all, where does the money that governments have spent and borrowed for the COVID crisis, where is it gone? It has gone mainly in the real economy. So that's the channels you have to look at, right? So the central bank has facilitated the capacity of countries to do fiscal policy for the benefit of the real economy. Now, at the same time, it's clear that some of the money creation has gone into the financial side of the economy, including, one part which is partly real economy and partly financial, which is the housing market. So everybody now is getting worried, not just in Europe, but also in the United States, about, once again, a housing bubble. So housing bubble is, when you say housing bubble, that's financial. When you say housing sector and new construction, this is the real economy. So there is a real side and there is a financial side. But the fact that indeed stock markets, housing markets, a number of financial markets have been at record high for the last few months, does indicate that there are potential problems of financial stability. So I personally do have the worry, and this is again I think a difficult position for central banks to find themselves, and that's why I think many central banks are wanting to come out of quantitative easing or similar kind of programs as soon as possible, because they do worry about the accumulation of financial of money that could result in financial difficulties, financial instability. So I think yes, the financial instability is something that we should be worried about, and I hope that the financial authorities that are also partly at the European Central Bank are watchful. I mean, we have financial authorities in Belgium, and the National Central Bank is in charge of also financial stability, together partly with the ECB. So I think they need to be watchful. And so I'm also in favor of, as soon as possible, coming to an end to the quantitative easing programs. Yes, we should do that, but without leading to austerity. I think this is the timing is really an issue. But this is the art of the central banks now, to be able to give messages to markets that we are coming slowly to an end of those programs, while at the same time not wanting to provoke a double deep recession.
Yeah. Okay. Furthermore, on green investments, there is a proposition here. Do you think big infrastructure works in road infrastructure that diminish traffic jams, congestion, and more freight transport also on trains, that could be considered as green investments?
Look, I mean, it's not for me to discuss now. I mean, that discussion, as I say, we'll need to have a political agreement, and the political agreement on what constitutes, as I said before, what constitutes green, and probably what constitutes green for a certain period. Okay? Whether it's rail or whether it's solar panels or whatever. I think that is a discussion that will need to be had, and there's no point whether my opinion doesn't matter really very much, whether I think rail is great or this is great. Okay, I mean, every one of us can make a list, and then I mean, it's fairly easy to make this list. But the main issue is, what will be the list that will be agreed upon? Can one agree upon on the list, and for how much? What would it will not be an open list, and it will not be for any amount of money. I'm sure they will want, if they could agree, it will be limited both in what constitutes green investment and the share of GDP that can be devoted to that. I'm sure that those two constraints will be there, and the monitoring. And again, the experience of the RRF, of the recovery and resilience facility, will be crucial. How well are the member states? How well is the Commission dealing with the monitoring of the expenditures? I think so far the Commission has done a good job. When I talk to people from governments who have been negotiating essentially with the Commission about what can be put in the investment, what can be, how the monitoring is taking place. I hear that the Commission has been quite strict. And I think the stricter the Commission is, and which is not always easy, again, because you're dealing with governments. So it's not easy for the Commission to oppose governments when you're asking governments to do all kinds of other things on other domains. So, you know, that's politics. So it's very complicated. It's how well the Commission is able to resist certain demands from member states and to take tough positions and to say no. The more the Commission is able to do that, obviously in a justified manner, the better it is for the future and for the possibility of putting in place the green golden rule. Because after all, the RRF does have a green window. So we are already in that kind of logic. And so I think conceptually, it's not too hard to go from the logic of the RRF to the logic of the green golden rule. You could say that we are already there. So one could extend it. It seems to me not, but provided that we all feel that, and member states feel, and that there is trust. There is trust of member states across each other. There is no cheating, and there is trust towards the Commission. Remember that one of the problems that we had, and I observed that sadly, during the financial crisis, especially during the sovereign debt crisis, and I think one can say it very openly because he said it very openly. The German finance minister at the time, Mr. Schäuble, on several occasions said that part of the responsibility for the crisis was due to poor monitoring on the part of the Commission. So there was no trust, at least on the part of the German government, on the part of the finance minister of the German government towards the Commission. Felt that the Commission had not managed the Stability and Growth Pact in a sufficient, strict manner, and essentially accused the Commission of being responsible of some countries creating excessive debt that had not been punished. That kind of atmosphere was very detrimental. I'm not saying that Mr. Schäuble was right or wrong. I'm not taking that position. You know, was the Commission right? Was Mr. Schäuble right? That does not matter. What mattered is that very openly, and I was even present once in the room someplace in Frankfurt, where Mr. Schäuble said those things. There was the press there, so it was not at all behind closed doors. So he, you know, very clearly said the Commission has done a poor job, and he does not trust the Commission. So that now, I think it seems to me that is behind us, certainly. But no, again, the Commission has a big responsibility. It has a big responsibility for the RRF. And again, my sense is that so far the Commission has done a very good job in being very strict and understanding what are the stakes. If the RRF is a failure, it will be a major, major setback for the governance of Europe, the economic governance of Europe, and especially the governance of the euro area. On the other hand, if it's a success, and again, I insist that Italy will be a big part of the judgment of whether it's a success or failure, then I think many things become possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your availability today and for the Council. Merci beaucoup, André, pour ta disponibilité. Je pense que tu as ouvert des portes, en tout cas pour les membres, sur les discussions que nous allons pouvoir avoir et les propositions que nous allons pouvoir faire. En tout cas, aujourd'hui, il y a des pistes, en tout cas, je pense, de réflexion possible sur une interprétation, entre guillemets, pas une modification, mais une interprétation des possibilités d'application des règles européennes. En tout cas, un grand, grand merci. On n'hésitera pas à revenir vers toi, en tout cas, quand on aura rédigé quelque chose, pour voir si, évidemment, tout ça est politiquement, comme tu l'as bien indiqué, tenable. Il ne suffit pas que ça soit économiquement réaliste, il faut aussi que ça soit politiquement défendable au niveau européen. En tout cas, merci à tous, merci à André, et je vous souhaite une excellente journée.